The hall was larger than anything the human had ever seen before. Its ceiling stretched so high it seemed to vanish into shadows, and the walls were covered in banners that displayed the power of the Empire. Rows upon rows of citizens filled the seats, their eyes fixed on the central stage. Leaders sat in tall chairs carved from stone and metal, their presence heavy with authority. In between the rows, smaller figures shifted nervously. Cubs, the young ones who had been brought to witness this gathering, their curious eyes watching everything. The human stood at the center, the only figure not dressed in the Empire's uniform colors. She wore simple clothes, marked not by wealth or rank, but by purpose. Her presence drew whispers and stares. Some in the crowd looked at her with respect, while others with suspicion. For many, she was a stranger from another world, but her voice had already begun to touch hearts long before this moment. The assembly was not just a meeting, it was a test. The Empire had allowed her to speak, perhaps to prove a point, or perhaps to expose her as weak, yet she carried no fear in her posture. She stood tall, her eyes moving slowly across the crowd, as if she wanted to make sure no face was unseen. The cubs closest to the front sat straighter when her gaze touched them, their small hands gripping each other for courage. A hush settled over the vast space as she prepared to speak. The hum of whispers, the sound of shifting feet, even the faint rustle of the banners seemed to fade. In that silence, the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. The leaders leaned forward slightly, waiting for her words, expecting either something bold or something that could be dismissed easily. For the human, this moment was more than a speech. It was a chance to share something beyond politics or control. It was about unity, about showing that even under the gaze of power, hope could not be silenced. She took a deep breath, steady and strong, knowing that every word she spoke might change how this story would be remembered, not just today, but for generations to come. The silence in the great hall broke as the human's voice carried across the space. It was not loud or forceful, but steady and calm, like the slow rise of dawn after a long night. She spoke without trembling, her tone filled with quiet strength that seemed to reach into every corner of the chamber. The words were simple, yet they carried weight, because they came not from pride or power, but from truth. She spoke of injustice, of how strength had been used to silence rather than protect. Her eyes moved across the leaders, their stiff faces betraying little, but she knew they were listening. Then she turned her gaze toward the citizens, and her words became softer, almost like she was speaking directly to them. She spoke of dignity, of respect, and of the value of every life, no matter how small or different. The cubs shifted in, their seats leaning closer, their ears twitching at her words. For them, it was rare to hear someone speak so openly, especially in a place where silence was often safer than honesty. Some of the older citizens nodded faintly, their expressions touched by something they hadn't felt in years, the stir of hope. But not everyone welcomed her voice. The leaders exchanged cold glances, their jaws tightening. To them, her words were dangerous, because they carried the power to inspire. Inspiration was harder to control than fear. Even among the citizens, there were those who stayed stiff, refusing to show any reaction, worried about being seen supporting her. Silent resentment lingered in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Still, the human pressed on, never raising her voice but making each word clear. She did not attack, she did not beg. She simply spoke as if every listener deserved honesty. She painted pictures of unity, of a world where no species lived under chains, where the young could grow without fear. Her courage lay not in shouting against power, but in daring to remind everyone of what they had forgotten. That respect was not a gift to be given by rulers, but a truth that belonged to all. For a moment, the hall felt less like a prison of control and more like a place where hearts could awaken. And though resentment flickered in the shadows, admiration glowed quietly, like embers waiting for the chance to ignite. Beneath the grand ceiling of the hall, while the human's words echoed with courage, there was another current moving quietly through the crowd. Not all ears listened with admiration. Hidden among the rows of leaders, merchants, and elders of the empire, a different exchange was taking place. One made not of words, but of glances, stiff nods, and shadows of resentment. The human speech carried hope to many, but to the powerful it sounded like a threat. For years, they had built their control on silence, on obedience, on fear. They were used to being obeyed without question, and here stood an outsider, speaking of respect and unity as if such things could undo centuries of their rule. Their hands rested tightly on the arms of their seats, claws or fingers digging in as their faces remained carefully composed. Outwardly, they appeared calm, but inside, their anger grew with each sentence the human spoke. One figure leaned slightly toward another, whispering words drowned out by the applause that rose from a section of the crowd. Their eyes, sharp and calculating, flickered with irritation. Another figure, cloaked in fine garments that marked authority, kept scanning the hall, not at the speaker but at the cubs and citizens who dared to nod in agreement. For them, this was more dangerous than any weapon, a seed of belief, planted in young hearts, growing stronger with every word. The citizens who noticed these glances felt their own fear rising. They knew the look of anger when authority was challenged. Still, they tried to keep their faces neutral, torn between the warmth they felt from the human's message and the fear of being punished if they showed support. The cubs, too young to fully understand politics, sensed the tension. Their wide eyes moved between the human's steady figure and the stiff leaders sitting in silence, like stone statues barely holding back storms inside. The hall no longer felt united. Two worlds existed in the same space, one stirred by courage and hope, the other threatened by it. And though the human continued with calm strength, the shadows of resistance thickened, as if waiting for the moment to strike back. What was once just glances and whispers was quickly becoming the beginning of something darker. The hall remained hushed, every eye fixed on the human who stood at the center of the grand assembly. Her words had carried steady strength since the moment she began. But now, beneath the weight of countless struggles, a faint tremble touched her voice. It was not weakness, but the toll of long battles fought before reaching this stage. Her chest rose and fell more heavily, her shoulders stiff with the effort of holding herself upright. Yet still, she refused to let her stance falter. Those who admired her saw more than just the slight strain. They saw the truth behind her strength, that it was not born of ease but of perseverance. Each pause in her voice reminded them that she had endured storms and scars, yet here she was, standing before the most powerful figures of the empire, daring to speak of fairness and respect. To many, this made her message even more real, for her courage was not polished, not perfect. It was human, and therefore deeply alive. The cubs, sitting close to the front, tilted their heads as they watched her. Their young senses picked up what the adults might have missed. They noticed the small waver in her tone, the brief tightening of her grip on the podium, the moment her eyes closed as though drawing strength from within. To them, she was not just speaking, she was fighting silently against an unseen weight. Their ears twitched, and their small bodies leaned forward as if to send her their unspoken support. In the higher seats, the powerful figures exchanged knowing glances. They mistook her tremor as weakness, as proof that she could not carry the burden she claimed. A few smirked faintly, convinced the strain would break her before her message could spread too far. To them, the sight of a wavering voice was no inspiration but an opportunity. Yet even as her body betrayed its tiredness, her eyes burned with determination. Each word, though slower now, rang with truth. Each sentence carried the weight of someone who refused to surrender, even when the body cried for rest. The assembly listened not just to her speech, but to her struggle, and in that moment, the hall was divided, between those who saw fragility and those who saw unshakable courage wrapped in human form. The words hung unfinished in the air as the human's body gave way to exhaustion. One moment she was standing tall, her voice carrying across the grand hall, and the next, her knees buckled under her. The sound of her collapse echoed against the stone floor, breaking the rhythm of the assembly like a sudden storm cutting through calm skies. For a heartbeat, silence ruled. The hall that had been filled with whispers, applause, and even quiet resentment now stood frozen. Every eye locked on the fallen figure. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, her hand pressing weakly against the floor as though she still wanted to rise. The strength in her voice, the fire in her eyes, all had burned so fiercely that few had imagined she could fall at all. Yet now, seeing her crumpled there, the audience felt a weight settle in their hearts. Some gasped softly, others clutched at one another, unsure if they had just witnessed the end of her fight. The cubs, who had been watching her with wide eyes, reacted first. Their small bodies tensed, their ears pinned back as a chorus of distressed howls filled the hall. The sound was raw and unrestrained, cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. Their voices carried grief, fear, and fierce loyalty all at once, shaking even the most hardened leaders who had come to the assembly. The overseers and council members who had hoped for her downfall exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected words to lose power, not this. They had thought the human's weakness would diminish her, but instead the cub's cries gave her collapse a new strength, an emotional weight that reached deeper than reason or politics. What had been seen as frailty now became a symbol, a reminder that her struggle was real and carried by bonds stronger than authority. Some in the audience rose from their seats, torn between moving to help her and waiting for the guards who lingered at the edges of the hall. The air was heavy, trembling with uncertainty. On the ground, the human lay still, her breath shallow but steady, her fall becoming more than a moment of weakness. It had turned into a spark, igniting voices not of power but of loyalty and love. The hall, which only moments ago carried the strong rhythm of her speech, now seemed to hold its breath. The sound of her collapse still echoed in every corner, and though the human lay weak on the cold floor, it was not only her struggle that filled the air, it was the silence of everyone watching. Gasps spread like ripples on water, quick and sharp, followed by uneasy murmurs as the weight of the moment pressed on every soul present. The guards, who had been standing tall at the edges of the chamber, shifted uncertainly, their hands hovering near their weapons but not moving forward. They had been trained to act swiftly, to follow orders without pause, yet now hesitation froze them in place. Something about the cubs' howls, their raw grief and defiance, made even hardened soldiers falter. Among the rows of leaders seated high above, whispers broke out like small cracks in a wall. Their words were low, urgent, tinged with unease. They spoke of control, of power, of the danger that might come if this moment slipped from their grasp. Yet their voices carried an undercurrent of something else, fear. The human had fallen, yes, but her collapse had not weakened her presence. It had magnified it, for in her weakness she revealed strength that no throne or crown could command. The cub's cries only made it clearer. Loyalty could not be demanded, it had to be earned, and they had given it to her freely. The Empire's representatives sat with stiff expressions, their faces trained into masks of calm. But their eyes betrayed them. Behind the polished composure lay sparks of panic, flickers of doubt, the quiet realization that control was slipping away. Every second the human remained on that floor, surrounded not by guards but by the loyalty of cubs, the balance of the hall shifted. Those who came expecting to see the Empire's power reinforced were instead watching it bend under the weight of something unseen but undeniable. The hall was no longer just a stage for a speech. It had become a battlefield of silence, whispers, and unspoken truths. Each breath held tension, each glance carried questions. And though no one moved, everyone felt the same chill. Fear had entered the hearts of those who believed themselves unshakable. The moment her body touched the ground, the cub's world shifted. For a heartbeat, the hall was still filled with shock and confusion, but then came a sound that cut through the silence, the urgent cries of the cubs. They rushed forward without a thought for rules or guards, their small forms moving with a speed born from pure instinct. They did not see soldiers, leaders, or the cold marble of the Empire's hall. They saw only her, the one who had listened to them, taught them, and treated them with the dignity no one else had shown. Fear should have kept them in their places, but their bond was stronger than fear. They slid across the floor, claws scraping against stone, and in moments they surrounded her fallen body. The audience gasped as the cubs formed a living shield, pressing shoulder to shoulder, their eyes glowing with defiance. Their growls were low at first, a warning, but as guards moved a single step closer, the cubs' voices rose in unison, sharper, louder, echoing off the walls until it was impossible to ignore. The sound carried not only anger but heartbreak, a cry that spoke of loyalty, love, and a desperate need to protect. People in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their gazes, others clutching their robes tighter as if the sound pierced deeper than they wished to admit. The guards froze. These were not trained soldiers or rebels. They were cubs, young and small, yet their courage shook the hall. To harm them would mean exposing the Empire's cruelty for all to see. To back away would mean showing weakness. The soldiers' hesitation only strengthened the cubs' stance. They pressed closer to her, tails lashing, eyes fixed on anyone who dared to approach. One small paw touched her hand, a gesture so simple yet filled with power, as though they were saying they would not leave her, not even here in the heart of danger. Around them, the hall trembled with unspoken tension. Leaders exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the moment was slipping from their control. The cubs had done what no weapon or speech could achieve. They had broken the illusion of order. And in that fragile silence, their defiance grew into something greater than themselves. It became a message that even the smallest voices could stand against an empire. The hall stood frozen, every breath caught in the heavy silence that followed her collapse. The cubs pressed tightly around her, their bodies tense, their eyes bright with a mixture of fear and determination. Then, from the center of the circle, one cub tilted its small head back. Its chest rose as if it carried the weight of the entire moment, and then came the sound. A howl, sharp and haunting, that rose into the air and rolled through the vast hall like a wave. It was not just a cry of an animal. It was a cry of loyalty, pain, and unshakable love. The sound pierced through stone walls, echoing upward toward the high ceiling, until it felt as though the entire building trembled with its sorrow. Gasps rippled across the crowd, and some clutched their ears not because the howl was painful, but because it struck something deeper, something human. The leaders of the Empire stiffened in their seats, their faces darkening as the sound grew stronger. They had expected silence, obedience, fear, but this was defiance born from the heart of the young. The howl carried the weight of truth, a sound so raw that it stripped away the polished mask of the grand assembly. For a moment, it no longer felt like a hall of power, but like a place where the weak finally demanded to be heard. The other cubs responded almost instantly. One by one, they lifted their voices to join the first, weaving together a chorus that filled every corner. The combined howls grew louder, vibrating against the walls, rising higher until the entire assembly shook with their cries. People in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances, some wiping their eyes without realizing tears had fallen. The sound was not only about the fallen human lying before them, it was about the bond between beings, about loyalty that no chains or authority could break. The guards, who had been ready to step forward moments ago, froze in place, their weapons heavy in their hands. No order from the Empire could push them against such a raw force. The cubs' voices had made the hall tremble not from fear of attack, but from the weight of truth. And as the echoes lingered in the air, the Empire itself felt shaken, because for the first time, its power was no match for the cry of the smallest hearts. The first cry had broken the silence, but it did not stand alone for long. One by one, more cubs lifted their heads, their small chests heaving as their howls joined together, each voice raw, pure, and unstoppable. The sound swelled and grew, rising like a storm that could not be contained by walls or commands. It shook the silence of the grand hall, echoing against stone pillars, spilling into every corner, until it felt as though the very air itself was alive with their cries. The audience, once restless and full of whispered judgments, now sat frozen in awe. Some clutched their hands together tightly, others bowed their heads, unable to ignore the truth carried in those unbroken voices. The Empire's leaders shifted uneasily in their seats. These were not the howls of frightened young. These were voices of defiance, of loyalty that no threat could erase. The more the cubs howled, the clearer it became that this was no childish outburst. It was a declaration, silent words made into sound, that the human lying on the ground meant something greater than fear, greater than authority, greater even than survival itself. The guards, who had been waiting for orders to act, stood stiff, their eyes darting nervously. They knew that if they stepped forward now, they would not just face the cubs, but the power of something deeper, something no weapon could crush. The sound grew and grew, carrying beyond the hall, spilling into the streets outside. Passers-by paused, lifting their heads as the cries reached them. For those who heard, it was impossible not to feel their hearts tremble. The cubs were not pleading. They were demanding that the world listen. And in that moment, it was clear no voice of authority could silence them. Inside the hall, the air was heavy with tension. Some leaders pressed their lips into thin lines, their pride wounded, while others lowered their gazes, unable to meet the sight of such loyalty. The chorus had turned into a storm unstoppable and wild, and at its center lay the human, protected not by chains of power but by the pure devotion of the young. It was a sight no one present would ever forget, for it revealed a truth stronger than the Empire's rule, that love and loyalty, once awakened, could never be silenced. The storm of howls filled every corner of the grand hall, refusing to fade. The cubs' voices carried weight beyond their size, and for the first time in years, the leaders of the Empire felt something they had long buried: uncertainty. They shifted in their seats, some tugging at their collars, others gripping the edges of their chairs as though steadying themselves against an unseen tremor. They had faced threats before, rebellions, protests, uprisings, but this was different. These cries were not shouted slogans or planned defiance. They were born out of raw loyalty, a sound so true that it pierced the armor of power and forced even the proudest to listen. What unsettled them most was not the volume of the howls, but the meaning behind them. This was not noise, it was a language of the heart. The cubs had chosen to stand with the human, not out of fear, but out of love and conviction. That loyalty, once revealed, could spread like fire. If young ones could rise in such a way, what would stop others from finding their courage? The thought was dangerous, and it rippled through the minds of those who had built their rule on silence and obedience. A few leaders leaned close to one. Another, whispering in tight voices, their words hurried and uneasy. They debated whether to order the guards forward, but even that command felt risky now. The guards themselves looked uncertain, their hands hovering but never moving. It was as if the howls had frozen them in place, stripping them of the authority they usually carried with a single step. The air, heavy and tense, seemed to press down on everyone. The people in the audience, who had come expecting a polished speech, now sat in stunned quiet. Some wiped their eyes, touched by the loyalty shown before them. Others clenched their fists in secret, realizing that the cubs had done what they themselves were too afraid to do: stand openly against injustice. In that moment, the Empire paused, not because it chose to, but because it had no choice. The cubs had cracked the mask of control, and behind it, fear was beginning to show. The hall was still ringing with the echoes of the cubs' howls when a different kind of movement began. At first it was quiet, almost hidden. A shift in the crowd, the lowering of eyes, the soft murmur of voices too faint to be called speech. Many citizens bowed their heads, shame burning on their faces. They had sat for years under the Empire's rule, pretending not to see its heavy hand, pretending they had no power to resist. Now, watching young cubs stand boldly, they felt the weight of their silence like a chain across their shoulders. Others, however, lifted their heads, their eyes bright with something long forgotten. They watched the cubs with admiration, their hearts stirred by the pure loyalty shown before them. A few nodded quietly, as though making a silent promise to themselves. In that moment, it no longer felt like just the cubs' act of courage. It felt like a spark, one that could spread through every row, every family, every hidden corner of the hall. The leaders of the Empire noticed these small shifts, and it unsettled them even more than the howls. Whispers passed from one seat to another, small but steady, carrying the story further with each breath. "Did you see? They protected her," someone muttered. "Even the young know the truth," another whispered back. These weren't just words. They were seeds being planted in fertile ground. Some citizens reached for the hands of their children, holding them tighter, as if recognizing the future was watching as well. Others looked at one another, quietly exchanging glances that said more than any speech could. "It's time we wake up." The air in the hall had shifted. It was no longer filled with fear alone, but with a quiet stirring. Shame, yes, but also courage. The cubs had not just howled for the human, they had howled for everyone who had ever felt powerless. And now, piece by piece, the crowd was beginning to understand. The Empire's grip, though still strong, had been shaken, not by weapons, not by orders, but by loyalty so pure it reached even the hearts of those who had once stayed silent. The heavy steps of the guards echoed through the hall as they moved forward, their armor catching the light, their weapons held firm. The air grew tense, the crowd holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But before the guards could reach the fallen human, the cubs stepped closer together, forming a barrier of small but unshakable bodies. Their paws pressed against the stone floor, their eyes bright with a fire that could not be dimmed. They were young, fragile compared to the armored soldiers, yet not one of them moved aside. The guards paused, surprised by the sight. These cubs should have been frightened, too weak to resist, but instead they stood tall, their backs straight, their teeth bared ever so slightly. It wasn't just instinct, it was devotion. They had chosen their place beside the human, no matter the cost. The audience could see the difference clearly. The Empire's power stood in rows of iron and command, while the cubs' strength came from loyalty and love. Every moment they held their ground, they sent a message louder than any shout. "She is ours. You will not touch her." The guards exchanged uneasy glances. Some tightened their grip on their weapons, but others hesitated, the weight of the cubs' courage shaking their certainty. To push past them now would not only mean harming the young, but also showing the world how fragile the Empire's honor truly was. A growl rose from the circle of cubs, deep and steady, vibrating through the hall. It wasn't just a sound of warning, it was a vow. Their small frames quivered with fear, yet their spirits stood unbroken. The human had protected them once, and now they would return that gift, no matter what stood in their way. Around them, murmurs grew louder, citizens watching in awe. Some clutched their chests, overcome by emotion. Others whispered to their neighbors, "Look at them." Even the young would rather fall than abandon her. The Empire wanted obedience, but the cubs had shown something far stronger, unyielding loyalty. In that moment, the guards weren't facing children. They were facing a wall of devotion that no blade could cut through. The hall was still heavy with silence, broken only by the low growls of the cubs standing guard. Then, a faint sound stirred the air. A weak breath, uneven, but alive. The human, who had fallen so suddenly, began to move. Her fingers twitched against the cold stone floor, and her chest rose with shallow breaths. The cubs noticed first. Their ears flicked toward her, their eyes softening even as their bodies stayed firm against the threat of the guards. One of them let out a small, hopeful whine, and the others leaned closer, brushing against her as if to lend their strength. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open. The harsh light of the hall stung at first, but then she saw them, the cubs circling her like a shield. Tears welled up, blurring her vision, not from pain, but from the overwhelming sight of loyalty. She had thought she was alone in this fight, crushed beneath the Empire's weight. Yet here they were, refusing to leave her side. Her lips parted, but no words came, only a faint whisper of breath. Still, her gaze spoke louder than any speech. She looked at each cub with gratitude, her weak hand lifting slightly as if reaching to touch them. One cub pressed its head against her palm, nuzzling with warmth, and in that small gesture, strength returned to her heart. The crowd saw it too. Murmurs spread like fire. "She lives," someone whispered, while others nodded in awe. The image was powerful. The human, broken but unbowed, surrounded by young lives ready to fight for her. It was a picture no amount of power could erase. Even the guards faltered, their steps frozen. For all their weapons, they could not move against this moment. The rulers sitting above shifted uneasily, realizing that every pair of eyes in the hall was no longer fixed on them, but on her and the cubs who would not abandon her. Her body was weak, but her spirit blazed brighter than before. She was alive, and because of the cubs' howls, she had risen not in silence but in unity. The hall no longer felt like the Empire's. The human had not spoken a single word since opening her eyes, yet the silence she carried spoke louder than the finest speech. She sat weakly among the cubs, their bodies pressed close to her, their eyes blazing with loyalty. That sight alone told everyone what words could not. Strength was not measured by power. Wealth or fear, it was found in loyalty, unity, and the bond between beings who trusted one another. The cubs did not need orders. They did not need promises. They had chosen to stand with her because their hearts knew she had once stood for them. Their defiance cut deeper into the Empire's pride than any rebellion could. Each howl, each growl, and even their silence now carried a message. No force could break a bond built on truth and care. Among the citizens gathered in the assembly, whispers spread quickly. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed that it took cubs, small and vulnerable, to display the courage they themselves had hidden. Others raised their heads high, inspired by what they saw, realizing that courage could rise even in the smallest hearts and spread like wildfire. The rulers sitting above shifted nervously. They had planned to crush the human's influence through silence and control. But now her very survival had undone them. She had collapsed, yes, but she had risen again, and in her rising, the cubs had given the people a story too powerful to erase. For the guards who had approached, their steps slowed. Their weapons felt heavier in their hands, as if weighed down by shame. To harm her now would not be an act of control, it would be an act of cruelty against innocence, and the crowd knew it. The human, still leaning on the cubs, closed her eyes for a moment, letting her strength gather quietly. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence, supported by the cubs, was a living truth. Power could command, but only loyalty could inspire. And that was a message no decree, no punishment, and no empire could silence. The story did not stay within the walls of the Great Hall. By the next dawn, it had spread like fire across the Empire's many worlds. Messengers carried it, citizens whispered it, and even those who had once feared speaking against their rulers found themselves repeating the tale with trembling pride. It was not the fall of armies or the clash of fleets that shook the Empire. It was the sound of cubs howling for a fallen human, and the sight of loyalty standing stronger than fear. Leaders who had once ruled with unchallenged authority now found unease creeping into their councils. They had planned to silence a single voice, but instead they had awoken many. For what could they do against a truth that needed no weapons to spread? The cubs' act of defiance had reached beyond politics and power. It had touched the hearts of those who longed for freedom and dignity. On distant colonies, workers spoke of the human's collapse and rise, telling one another that courage could come even in the weakest moment. In homes, parents repeated the story to their children, pointing to the cubs' loyalty as a lesson in what it meant to protect what was right. Even in the military ranks of the Empire, some soldiers whispered quietly, asking themselves whether their loyalty truly belonged to those who ruled or to those who inspired. The Empire tried to contain the tale, but it was too late. No chain could hold it, no guard could silence it, and no decree could erase the memory of that howl echoing in the assembly. It became more than a story. It became a symbol. A symbol that said, true strength was not found in crushing others, but in standing together even when the odds seemed impossible. For the human, still weak but alive, the knowledge of this spreading truth gave her quiet hope. She had come to this place to speak of unity, and though her voice had failed, the cubs had carried her message farther than she ever could have alone. The Empire stood shaken, not by rebellion, not by war, but by the bond between a human and cubs whose voices proved stronger than silence. And from that day forward, the rulers knew they faced not just opposition, but an idea that could not be chained.